Before the pyramids, before written language, before the first cities rose from the earth, human beings were already gathering around the dead in the darkness. An Ice Age hunter stops breathing beside a fading fire, and suddenly the entire group faces a mystery they cannot explain. What do you do with someone who was alive only moments ago, across caves, frozen plains, and ancient forests? Early humans painted bodies red, carried skulls across vast landscapes, buried children with ornaments, and sometimes returned to the dead again and again for generations. Tonight, we explore the haunting world of prehistoric mourning and the strange rituals ancient hunters created to survive grief, fear, and memory itself. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The fire is still burning when they realize he's not breathing anymore. Smoke drifts upward into the cold darkness beneath the rock overhang, mixing with the smell of damp earth, animal fat, and wet hides. Beyond the shelter, wind moves across an Ice Age plain where almost nothing survives for long. The hunters returned only hours ago, carrying meat from a wounded reindeer dragged across frozen ground. Their hands are split from cold, their legs ache from distance. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, wolves are already moving, but inside the shelter, something far older and stranger than hunger has suddenly taken hold of the group. The man lying beside the embers is no longer simply asleep. For hundreds of thousands of years, early humans lived close to death, injury, infection, starvation, predators, winter storms, and accidents shaped nearly every generation. Most people likely died young by modern standards. Yet what matters is not that death existed. Death exists for every social animal on Earth. What matters is that at some point, ancient humans began reacting to death differently. The evidence survives only in fragments scattered through caves, sediments, and ancient graves. But those fragments suggest a profound shift in human thought. A body stopped being only a body. The dead became something dangerous, meaningful, remembered, or sacred. At first, the change may have been subtle. A group lingers beside the dead longer than necessary. Someone covers the face. Someone refuses to leave the body exposed to scavengers. A child cries beside a parent who no longer moves. The fire burns late into the night because nobody wants to sleep. These moments leave almost no trace in archaeology, yet they may represent the beginning of one of humanity's oldest emotional transformations. What survives in the record suggests that prehistoric hunter-gatherers often faced death directly and physically in ways modern societies rarely experience. There are no hospitals, no sealed coffins, no distant cemeteries maintained by strangers. Death happens nearby. The dead remain visible. Bodies decay in front of the living. During winter migrations, corpses sometimes freeze before burial. In warmer climates, decomposition begins almost immediately. Hunters understand the smell of death because they smell it constantly in the animals they butcher. But human death carries a different emotional weight, one that appears to deepen over time. Some of the oldest clues come not from grand tombs or monuments, but from absences. Archaeologists notice places where bodies seem deliberately protected rather than abandoned. Bones appear positioned instead of scattered. Skeletons remain intact when scavengers should have torn them apart. In some sites, bodies were placed into pits or crevices that served no obvious practical purpose. Scholars still debate exactly when intentional burial truly began, because the evidence remains incomplete and difficult to interpret. A naturally covered body can sometimes resemble a deliberate grave after tens of thousands of years underground. Yet certain discoveries stand apart because chance alone cannot easily explain them. One of the most haunting examples comes from the Middle Paleolithic world of Neanderthals and early modern humans. In caves stretching from Western Europe to the Near East, archaeologists uncover bodies laid in curled positions beneath layers of earth. Some appear arranged carefully, almost as if sleeping. At sites like Shanidar Cave, human remains reveal possible evidence of care extending far beyond death itself. One individual survived crippling injuries for years before dying, suggesting others protected and fed him long after he could no longer hunt effectively. That alone changes the picture of prehistoric life. These groups are not simply surviving from day to day like isolated animals. They remember, they care for the weak, and eventually they mourn. The emotional atmosphere around death may also have carried deep practical fears. A corpse attracts predators. It spreads disease. It reminds the living of their own fragility. Some anthropologists believe early funerary behavior partly emerged from attempts to manage these dangers. Covering bodies with earth may initially have been practical before becoming symbolic. Yet practical explanations alone cannot fully account for the care visible in certain ancient burials. Some bodies were placed with tools, pigments, flowers, antlers, or animal bones. These actions required effort from people already living on the edge of survival. And survival during the Ice Age often balanced on impossibly narrow margins. During glacial winters, temperatures across parts of Eurasia could plunge far below freezing for months. Entire landscapes became treeless steppes stretching toward distant ice sheets. Hunters followed migrating herds across enormous distances while carrying children, tools, and fire-making materials. Every calorie mattered. A serious injury could doom an entire group. Under such conditions, stopping to bury the dead represented a costly decision. Digging frozen ground with stone tools was brutally difficult. Carrying a body slowed migration. Remaining in one place too long risked starvation, yet again and again. The archaeological record suggests they stopped anyway. The reasons remain partly hidden inside minds that vanished tens of thousands of years ago. Some scholars believe burial reflects the emergence of symbolic thinking, the growing human ability to imagine abstract ideas, memory, identity, or an existence beyond visible life. Others argue that even earlier species may have possessed rudimentary forms of grief and ritual. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence. Chimpanzees today sometimes remain beside dead companions for hours or days. Elephants touch bones with their trunks and revisit places where herd members died. The roots of mourning may reach far deeper into evolutionary history than once believed. Yet humans transformed mourning into something uniquely elaborate. A death changes the social structure of a hunting band immediately. An experienced hunter disappears, a mother loses protection, a child loses knowledge, skills vanish that may never be replaced, oral memory weakens. In small groups of perhaps 20 or 30 individuals, every person matters intensely. The death of one adult during winter could alter the survival odds of everyone else. Ancient hunter-gatherers likely understood this reality with painful clarity. Mourning was not abstract sadness. It carried direct consequences measured in hunger, vulnerability, and fear. Around the fire, reactions may have varied sharply. Some individuals perhaps avoided the corpse entirely. Others remained close beside it. There may already have been taboos about touching the dead or speaking certain names. The evidence from later hunter-gatherer societies suggests that death rituals often helped stabilize emotions during periods of chaos. Shared actions gave structure to grief. The body was washed, painted, wrapped, burned, buried, exposed, or carried according to traditions passed through generations. These rituals reassured the living that death could be managed, even if never fully understood. But in the earliest periods, before traditions fully formed, death may have felt terrifyingly unpredictable. Imagine the silence after breathing stops in a world without medicine or explanation. The group watches carefully for movement that never returns. Heat leaves the skin, eyes cloud, rigor slowly stiffens the limbs. The body becomes familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. For prehistoric people living close to the rhythms of nature, this transformation must have seemed deeply unsettling. Something invisible had departed, yet the physical form remained. That contradiction may have helped shape humanity's earliest ideas about spirits, souls, or unseen forces lingering near the dead. The fire continues burning because darkness beyond the shelter feels suddenly larger than before. Somebody adds more wood. Nobody sleeps easily. And somewhere in that long prehistoric night, among hunters wrapped in hides while cold wind moves beyond the cave mouth, the human relationship with death begins changing forever. By the time dawn arrives, the problem of the body can no longer be delayed. The hunters cannot remain beneath the rock shelter forever. Meat must be dried before it spoils. Water must be gathered. Tracks in the snow must be watched carefully for predators following the scent of blood and smoke. Yet the dead man still lies beside the dying embers, and nobody in the group treats him the way they would treat an animal carcass. That distinction, fragile and almost invisible at first, may represent one of the most important psychological changes in human history. At some distant point in prehistory, humans stopped seeing death as merely the end of movement and began attaching meaning to it. The dead became socially important even after life ended. A corpse was no longer only organic matter returning to the landscape. It became memory, identity, fear, obligation, perhaps even presence. Exactly when this transformation began remains fiercely debated. The archaeological record from deep prehistory is incomplete, damaged, and often ambiguous. Bones shift underground over thousands of years, caves collapse, rivers scatter skeletons, scavengers drag remains across open ground. In many cases, archaeologists work from fragments so small they could fit inside a backpack, yet across Africa, Europe, and Western Asia. Certain discoveries continue to suggest that ancient humans gradually developed behaviors impossible to explain through simple accident alone. One of the earliest and most controversial clues comes from a cave system in southern Africa known as Rising Star Cave. Deep inside narrow passages, researchers uncovered remains belonging to a species called Homo naledi. The chambers are extraordinarily difficult to reach, requiring squeezes through spaces barely wide enough for a modern human chest. What startled scientists was not only the number of bones, but their apparent concentration in areas isolated from predators and natural water transport. Some researchers propose that Homo naledi may have deliberately placed bodies inside the cave nearly 250,000 years ago. If true, the implications are enormous. Homo naledi possessed a relatively small brain compared to modern humans. For generations, many scientists assumed complex ritual behavior required larger brains and advanced symbolic thinking. Yet the cave discoveries complicated that assumption. Scholars still debate the interpretation fiercely. Some argue natural processes could explain the accumulation. Others believe the evidence points toward intentional deposition of the dead. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail. But even the debate itself reveals how deeply researchers now question older ideas about when human emotional complexity truly emerged. Long before cities, kings, or written religion, something emotional and symbolic may already have been developing among small bands of hunters living in dangerous landscapes. The same uncertainty surrounds Neanderthals. For much of modern history, Neanderthals were portrayed as primitive creatures barely capable of thought beyond survival. That image has slowly collapsed under decades of archaeological evidence. Burials associated with Neanderthals appear in multiple regions, though not all archaeologists agree every site represents true funerary ritual. At places such as La Chapelle-aux-Saints, skeletons appear positioned inside depressions that resemble graves. In other caves, bodies seem intentionally protected from scavengers and weather. What matters is not merely whether a hole was dug. What matters is the intention behind the act. Intentional burial suggests planning, cooperation, emotional attachment, and possibly ideas about what death means. Even a simple grave represents labor invested in someone who can no longer contribute to survival. That is a profound shift. For most animals, death ends social value almost immediately. A dead member of the group becomes irrelevant or dangerous, but humans increasingly behaved as though the dead still mattered. In some sites, bodies were curled into fetal positions before burial, perhaps reflecting symbolic ideas about sleep, rebirth, or returning to the earth. In others, graves included tools or animal remains. One ancient child burial in what is now Israel contained deer antlers placed carefully beside the body. These gestures hint at thought processes far beyond practical disposal. And yet, uncertainty shadows every interpretation. Ancient graves do not come with explanations. No voices survive to describe beliefs. Archaeologists reconstruct meaning from fragments of pigment, bone arrangement, microscopic pollen traces, and soil discoloration. Even the famous claim that Neanderthals buried their dead with flowers remains disputed. At Shanidar Cave, pollen discovered near one skeleton was once interpreted as evidence of floral offerings placed during burial. Later researchers argued rodents could have introduced the pollen naturally. The debate continues because prehistoric intentions are extraordinarily difficult to recover with certainty. Still, what survives in the record suggests growing emotional sophistication among multiple human species. The treatment of the body itself reveals part of this transformation. Many ancient burials show unusual care in positioning limbs or protecting remains. In some graves, stones were placed around bodies as if marking boundaries between the dead and living. Certain skeletons appear intentionally covered with earth shortly after death, reducing scavenger damage. These actions may sound simple by modern standards, but within the brutal conditions of prehistoric life, they represent meaningful investments of time and energy. Hunter-gatherer existence often depended on relentless movement. Groups followed migrations, seasonal plants, rivers, coastlines, and shifting climates. Remaining stationary carried risks. Food vanished quickly. Weather changed suddenly. Rival groups competed for territory. Yet burial required stopping. Digging even shallow graves with stone or bone tools demanded exhausting physical effort, especially in frozen ground, in Arctic or permafrost regions. Some bodies may have remained exposed temporarily until soil softened enough for burial later in the year. Death therefore interrupted survival itself. The interruption may have been emotionally necessary. Modern studies of grief suggest ritualized behavior helps stabilize communities after loss by creating predictable actions during chaos. Ancient humans likely discovered similar truths through experience rather than theory. Shared mourning reinforced group bonds. It reminded survivors that they still belong to one another, despite danger and uncertainty. The dead may also have become anchors for memory in societies without writing. A burial site preserved identity in physical space. This valley is where she rests. That cave belongs to our ancestors. Those hills are where the old hunters died during winter famine. Over generations, landscapes themselves became layered with memory. Some anthropologists believe this growing connection between people and burial places helps strengthen territorial attachment. A region containing ancestral graves became more than hunting ground. It became homeland. The dead tied communities to specific caves, rivers, and migration routes. This emotional geography may eventually have shaped larger social structures long before agriculture emerged. At the same time, death almost certainly inspired fear as well as reverence. Many traditional hunter-gatherer societies recorded in more recent centuries viewed corpses as spiritually dangerous. The dead could become restless, angry, or contaminating. Certain names were avoided after death. Personal belongings were destroyed or buried. Camps were abandoned following a burial. Scholars caution against projecting recent beliefs directly onto prehistoric societies, but such patterns suggest that early funerary behavior may have combined affection with anxiety. The dead were mourned precisely because they remained psychologically powerful. That power emerges clearly in one unsettling detail repeated across prehistoric archaeology. Some graves appear revisited long after burial. Bones were sometimes removed, rearranged, or handled again months or years later. This suggests the relationship between living and dead did not always end at burial itself. In certain societies, the dead may have continued participating symbolically in community life. The implications are haunting. A hunter dies during winter. His companions bury him beneath stone and earth beside a familiar valley. Seasons pass. Snow melts and returns. Herds migrate again. 1 year later, the group revisits the grave. Children who barely remember his face now hear stories beside the burial place. His tools may still circulate among relatives. His absence becomes identity. His death becomes narrative. And narrative changes everything. Because once humans begin building stories around the dead, death itself becomes larger than biology. It becomes history. It becomes belonging. It becomes the invisible thread connecting generations who will never meet. The fire beside the shelter burns differently now, not because the flames have changed, but because the people watching them have begun changing instead. Long before gold, before temples, before written prayers carved into stone, prehistoric humans were already carrying powdered red earth across dangerous landscapes for reasons nobody fully understands. The pigment appears suddenly and repeatedly in ancient graves separated by thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years. Sometimes it dusts the bones lightly. Sometimes entire skeletons are soaked in deep crimson, in a world dominated by grey rock, brown soil, ash, snow, and darkness. The colour must have seemed startlingly alive. The dead were being painted. Archaeologists call the pigment ochre, usually a naturally occurring iron-rich mineral ground into powder and mixed with fat, water, or animal marrow. Red ochre appears throughout prehistoric archaeology in contexts connected to art, body decoration, tool-making, and burial. But its presence inside graves carries a particular emotional weight because the colour resembles fresh blood. Again and again. Ancient hunters covered the dead in red as though trying to restore warmth and life to bodies already slipping into the earth. No single explanation fully accounts for the practice. Scholars still debate whether ochre symbolized rebirth, vitality, protection, status, identity, or something far stranger now lost entirely to time. Yet the consistency of its appearance across enormous distances suggests the colour held deep psychological power for prehistoric people. Some of the oldest known examples come from Africa, where evidence for ochre use stretches back more than 100,000 years. At sites associated with early Homo sapiens, pieces of ochre show scraping marks from grinding and shaping in caves near the southern African coast. Archaeologists uncovered shells containing ochre mixtures that may have functioned almost like primitive paint containers. These discoveries suggest humans were already experimenting with symbolic colour long before civilization emerged. But burial transformed pigment into something more intimate. At the site of Sungheir, dating to roughly 34,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered one of the most extraordinary Ice Age burials ever found. Bodies lay covered in red ochre alongside thousands of ivory beads painstakingly carved from mammoth tusks. Spears, ornaments, and animal remains surrounded the dead. Two children buried head to head appeared adorned with astonishing quantities of decorative objects that would have required immense labour to produce. The graves challenge simplistic ideas about prehistoric hunter societies as emotionally or socially primitive. These people invested enormous effort into honouring their dead, and always there is the red pigment. The visual effect must have been unforgettable. Imagine torchlight flickering across crimson-covered bodies deep inside a cold grave pit, while winter wind moves through nearby trees. The colour of blood, iron, sunset, and raw meat becomes permanently linked with death itself. In some burials, ochre was sprinkled carefully over specific body parts. In others, graves were lined entirely with red-stained earth. The repetition suggests ritual knowledge passed across generations. What survives in the record suggests that prehistoric people often travelled significant distances to obtain high-quality ochre. Certain mineral sources became valued enough to support long journeys or exchange networks between groups. This alone implies the pigment mattered far beyond casual decoration. Hunters already struggling for survival still devoted time and energy to gathering red earth for the dead. Why? Part of the answer may lie in how early humans perceived the body itself. Blood represented visible life. Wounds bled. Animal carcasses lost warmth as blood drained away. Childbirth brought blood into the world. Menstrual blood appeared mysteriously and cyclically. Across many later human cultures, red became associated with vitality, danger, transformation, and spiritual power. Prehistoric symbolism likely differed enormously between regions and eras, yet the connection between red and life may have emerged very early in human consciousness. Some archaeologists believe ochre burials reflect attempts to symbolically return life to the dead or prepare them for another existence. Others argue the pigment served as protection, either spiritual or practical. Ochre possesses preservative properties and can deter insects under certain conditions. But purely practical explanations struggle to explain the emotional care visible in many graves. Some burials contain astonishing quantities of pigment far beyond any functional necessity. At Lake Mungo, archaeologists discovered the remains of a woman cremated approximately 40,000 years ago and another individual buried with red ochre nearby. The burial is among the oldest known examples of ritualized funerary treatment in Australia and demonstrates how symbolic practices emerged independently across distant human populations. These were not isolated behaviors confined to one culture or region. Ancient humans repeatedly developed rituals surrounding death wherever they spread. The evidence becomes even more intriguing when examining children's graves. At several Upper Paleolithic sites in Europe, Infants and young children received elaborate burials despite contributing little to survival in strictly economic terms. Some were covered heavily in ochre and accompanied by ornaments, beads, or animal remains. The emotional implications are profound. Hunter-gatherer life carried extremely high child mortality rates. Parents likely experienced repeated loss throughout their lives, yet instead of treating infant death as routine, some communities devoted extraordinary attention to mourning their youngest members. This suggests prehistoric emotional worlds may have been deeper and more complex than older stereotypes once allowed. The use of ochre also connects death rituals to identity and performance among the living. Many hunter-gatherer societies historically painted bodies during ceremonies, initiations, hunts, or periods of mourning. Red pigment transformed appearance. It marked transitions between social states. A living hunter coated in ochre may have resembled the dead buried beneath red earth. The boundary between ritual, memory, and identity likely blurred in ways difficult for modern societies to fully reconstruct. And there is another possibility scholars sometimes consider carefully. Perhaps prehistoric humans believed colour itself possessed power. In environments dominated by darkness and uncertainty, vivid pigments carried emotional force. Firelight intensified reds dramatically. Blood-coloured bodies inside graves may have created experiences that felt spiritually charged, even without organised religion in any later sense. Humans are intensely visual creatures. Certain colours provoke instinctive responses tied to danger, attraction, fear, or vitality. Ancient burial rituals may have exploited those responses long before anyone understood them consciously. Still, the evidence remains incomplete. Many graves vanished long ago through erosion, scavenging, flooding, or simple time. Others survive only partially. Archaeologists rarely uncover full ceremonies, only their aftermath frozen inside soil. A grave containing ochre tells us something important happened, but not precisely what participants believed while performing it. That uncertainty becomes part of the mystery itself. Somewhere during the Upper Paleolithic, beneath open skies filled with migrating birds and glacial winds, hunters gather around a shallow grave dug with antler picks and stone blades. The body inside is motionless. The mourners carry small bundles of powdered red mineral collected from distant cliffs or riverbanks. Fingers stained crimson scatter pigment slowly across skin and fur garments. Perhaps songs are sung. Perhaps silence holds the group together. Children watch carefully because they are learning what death means. The red earth settles over the dead like a second skin. Thousands of years later, archaeologists brushing dust from ancient bones still find traces of that colour clinging stubbornly to the soil. The people themselves vanished long ago. Their language disappeared. Their beliefs dissolved into prehistory. Yet the red remains, vivid, even after tens of millennia, carrying with it the unmistakable sign that ancient hunters believed death deserved more than abandonment. They believed the dead should be transformed. Some of the oldest graves in human history are hidden far from sunlight. Not beside rivers where camps once stood, and not beneath open plains where herds migrated through the seasons, but deep inside caves where darkness swallows sound and cold air barely moves. Reaching these places often requires climbing through jagged stone passages, squeezing through narrow chambers, or descending into spaces where no natural reason seems to invite the living, yet again and again. Prehistoric people carried their dead into these hidden interiors as though the earth itself had become part shelter, part tomb, and part boundary between worlds. The deeper archaeologists explore ancient cave systems, the stranger the story becomes. Caves held enormous importance for prehistoric hunter-gatherers long before formal burial practices emerged. They offered shelter from storms, protection from predators, and stable temperatures during brutal winters. Fires burned inside cave mouths while families slept beneath soot-darkened ceilings. Walls became canvases for paintings of bison, mammoths, horses, and handprints. In many regions, caves were among the few places where human traces could survive tens of thousands of years. But some caves appear to have served another purpose entirely. They became places for the dead. At sites stretching from Western Europe into the Near East, archaeologists discovered bodies intentionally placed inside cave chambers separated from ordinary living areas. In some cases, burials occur near ancient hearths, suggesting the dead remained close to daily community life. In others, bodies were carried astonishing distances into deep cave passages where darkness becomes nearly absolute. The effort required is difficult to overstate. Navigating Ice Age caves with flickering firelight while carrying a corpse across uneven stone would have been exhausting and dangerous. Which raises a difficult question. Why go so far underground at all? One possibility is practical preservation. Deep caves protect remains from scavengers, weather, and erosion. A body left on open ground rarely survives intact for long. Wolves, hyenas, vultures, and other scavengers dismantle corpses rapidly. Floods scatter bones. Frost crack skeletons apart. Caves reduce these threats, yet practical explanations alone fail to explain the emotional patterns visible in many cave burials. Some chambers appear deliberately chosen despite being inconvenient or isolated from ordinary habitation. At Cima de los Huesos, researchers uncovered one of the most remarkable accumulations of ancient human remains ever discovered. Deep within a vertical shaft known as the Pit of Bones, thousands of skeletal fragments belonging to at least 28 individuals were found dating back roughly 430,000 years. The remains are associated with an early human population ancestral to Neanderthals. Scholars still debate how the bodies reached the chamber. Some researchers propose deliberate deposition of the dead. Others argue natural processes may explain at least part of the accumulation. But one detail continues haunting the debate. Among the bones, archaeologists discovered a finely crafted hand axe made from red quartzite. Unlike the surrounding stone, nicknamed Excalibur, the tool appears unusually decorative and shows little evidence of practical use. Some scholars cautiously suggest it may have been placed alongside the dead intentionally, perhaps representing one of humanity's earliest funerary offerings. The evidence remains uncertain, and many archaeologists urge caution against overinterpretation. Yet the possibility lingers because the cave itself feels difficult to explain through ordinary accident alone. Deep cave burials appear repeatedly throughout later prehistoric periods as well. At El Miron Cave, archaeologists uncovered the burial of a woman from roughly 19,000 years ago, placed in a secluded rear chamber stained with red ochre. The location was not a casual dumping place. Reaching it required deliberate movement into darkness. Nearby engravings and artifacts suggest the chamber may have carried ritual significance long before or after the burial itself. The woman's body eventually disappeared through natural disturbance, but enough survived to reveal extraordinary care in how she was treated. Caves also preserve another unsettling reality about prehistoric funerary life. The living often returned repeatedly to places containing the dead. Unlike modern cemeteries, where graves are frequently separated from daily life, prehistoric cave sites blur boundaries between habitation, ritual, and memory. Fires burned near ancient burials. Stone tools were made beside old skeletons, New generations slept in chambers containing ancestors beneath the floor. In some caves, bones from different individuals became mixed over centuries as groups revisited and reused burial spaces. This suggests prehistoric people may not have feared the physical presence of the dead in the same way many later societies would. Or perhaps they feared it intensely but believed caves controlled that danger. Anthropologists studying later traditional societies have often observed that caves carry symbolic associations with transformation, spirits, origins, and entrances to hidden realms. Scholars remain careful about projecting such beliefs backward into deep prehistory, but caves naturally provoke psychological reactions even today. Darkness distorts distance and sound. Firelight makes walls appear alive. Air currents emerge from invisible cracks in the stone. Deep underground chambers feel separate from ordinary reality. For prehistoric hunters living in landscapes filled with predators and uncertainty, caves may have seemed like thresholds between worlds. The dead entered spaces ordinary life rarely touched. Some archaeologists believe this separation reflects emerging spiritual ideas about death itself. A body placed deep underground symbolically leaves the human world behind. The earth receives the dead physically while the living return to daylight. Yet no single explanation fully accounts for the enormous diversity of cave burial practices across different cultures and time periods. Some groups buried individuals carefully in isolated chambers. Others left scattered bones or partial remains. In certain caves, skulls appear arranged deliberately long after flesh disappeared. And there is another darker possibility scholars sometimes consider. Certain cave deposits may reflect episodes not of reverence, but of violence, cannibalism, or social collapse. Human bones bearing cut marks from stone tools have been discovered in multiple prehistoric cave sites. At places like Guff's Cave, researchers uncovered evidence suggesting Magdalenian hunter-gatherers processed human bodies in ways similar to animal carcasses roughly 15,000 years ago. Some skulls were shaped into cup-like forms after death. Scholars debate whether such treatment reflects starvation cannibalism, ritual behavior, warfare, ancestor veneration, or combinations of multiple practices. The evidence remains deeply controversial because prehistoric intentions are almost impossible to recover fully. What becomes increasingly clear, however, is that caves concentrated emotional intensity. They preserved bodies, memories, fears, and rituals together in enclosed darkness. Inside these chambers, ancient humans confronted mortality directly. Fires illuminated the faces of mourners, while nearby walls carried paintings of animals crucial for survival. The living and dead occupied the same spaces repeatedly across generations. Imagine entering such a cave during winter. Outside, snow sweeps across the landscape beneath a pale sky. Reindeer migrate through distant valleys. Wolves move silently between frozen trees. But inside the cave, torchlight flickers against walls blackened by centuries of smoke. Deep in the chamber rests the body of someone the group knew intimately. A hunter, a mother, a child. The air smells of damp stone, ash, ochre, and animal fat. Silence presses heavily underground except for distant dripping water echoing through darkness. The living kneel beside the dead, and somewhere in those hidden chambers, far from sunlight and ordinary life, prehistoric humans begin transforming caves into places not merely of shelter, but of memory itself. Few discoveries disturb archaeologists more deeply than the graves of children. An adult burial can sometimes be interpreted through status, labour, hunting skill, or social position. But when prehistoric hunter-gatherers devoted extraordinary effort to burying infants and young children, the emotional meaning becomes harder to ignore. These were individuals who had barely begun life in worlds where survival depended on strength, endurance, and contribution to the group. Food was never guaranteed. Winters killed the weak without hesitation. Illness spread quickly through small communities with no medicine beyond herbs, experience, and luck. Yet again and again, ancient hunters paused their struggle for survival to mourn children with astonishing tenderness. Tiny skeletons appear beneath layers of red ochre. Small beads rest beside fragile ribs, animal teeth, shells, antlers, and carved ornaments accompany bodies too young to understand the objects buried with them. Some graves required immense labour. Others were positioned carefully inside caves or beneath shelters where surviving relatives would continue living nearby. These burials suggest something emotionally profound about prehistoric societies. Children mattered far beyond practical survival. At the remarkable Upper Paleolithic site of Sunghir, 2 children buried roughly 34,000 years ago continue to puzzle researchers today. One was around 10 years old, the other perhaps 12 or 13. Their bodies were placed head-to-head inside an elaborate grave covered with red ochre and surrounded by extraordinary objects. Archaeologists uncovered more than 10,000 ivory beads sewn onto clothing that had long since decayed away. Each bead required carving, polishing, and drilling by hand using stone tools. Spears made from straightened mammoth ivory lay beside them, along with fox teeth ornaments and carved artifacts. The labour invested in the burial must have been immense. What makes the site even stranger is that skeletal evidence suggests both children may have lived with serious physical conditions or disabilities. Scholars still debate the exact diagnosis because ancient remains are difficult to interpret with certainty. But what survives in the record suggests these children required sustained care during life. Instead of abandonment, they received one of the richest burials known from the Ice Age world. The implications are enormous. For generations, prehistoric hunter-gatherers were often imagined as emotionally hardened people forced by harsh conditions to value survival above compassion. Yet graves like Sunghir challenge that image directly. These communities sometimes protected vulnerable individuals for years and mourned them intensely after death. The emotional bonds visible in such burials feel unmistakably human, even across tens of thousands of years. And Sunghir was not unique. At Upward Sun River, archaeologists uncovered the remains of 2 infants buried together roughly 11,500 years ago, near the end of the Ice Age. One infant had likely died shortly after birth. The other was stillborn or miscarried late in pregnancy. The burial included stone tools, antler rods, and traces of cremated remains from another child nearby. The grave was eventually covered by a hearth, suggesting the site remained emotionally important after burial itself. The discovery transformed understanding of early populations in the far north, because it revealed not only migration patterns into the Americas, but also intimate family grief preserved beneath Arctic soil. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that prehistoric parents experienced devastating emotional loss with painful regularity. Infant mortality rates were extremely high in hunter-gatherer societies. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, infections, and harsh weather killed many children before adulthood. Women likely endured repeated pregnancies under physically exhausting conditions while migrating constantly across difficult terrain. Yet repeated exposure to death did not eliminate grief. In some ways, it may have intensified the emotional importance of surviving children even further. Small hunter bands depended heavily on cooperation between generations. Children represented continuity, memory, and future survival. They learned migration routes, animal behavior, tool-making skills, and oral traditions from elders over many years. A child's death therefore carried both emotional and social consequences. Future hunters disappeared before they could grow. Family lines ended. Knowledge transmission weakened. Some scholars believe elaborate child burials reveal another important transformation in human thought. The idea that identity and social belonging existed independently of age or productivity. A very young child who had contributed little materially to group survival could still receive ceremonial treatment usually associated with respected adults. This suggests prehistoric communities valued emotional connection itself, not merely practical usefulness. The graves also reveal something quieter and more intimate. Parents touched these bodies. Someone placed beads beside tiny hands. Someone wrapped children in hides or clothing before burial. Someone carried them into caves or lowered them carefully into graves dug with exhausting effort through frozen soil. Archaeology often deals in abstraction and deep time, but child burials collapse that distance abruptly. They reveal moments of grief so familiar that modern observers can almost feel them directly. At several European Upper Paleolithic sites, infants were buried wearing ornaments crafted from shells, ivory, or animal teeth. Some scholars interpret these objects as symbols of family identity or protection. Others believe they marked social status inherited through kinship. No single explanation fully accounts for the diversity of burial practices, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the emotional care itself is difficult to dismiss. In some regions, children appear buried within living spaces rather than separate cemeteries. Tiny skeletons have been discovered beneath hut floors or near hearths, where families continued daily life above them. Anthropologists studying later traditional societies sometimes interpret such practices as attempts to keep the dead close to the community, especially vulnerable children believed to require continued spiritual protection. Again, caution is necessary when comparing vastly different cultures across time, yet the pattern of closeness appears repeatedly enough to suggest deep emotional significance. The deaths of children may also have shaped prehistoric spiritual beliefs profoundly. Adults die after years of life experience. Their deaths, while painful, can sometimes feel understandable within harsh environments. But the death of a child often appears senseless. Even modern societies struggle emotionally with that reality. Ancient hunters lacking scientific explanations for illness or sudden death may have searched desperately for meaning. Rituals surrounding child burials could have emerged partly from attempts to manage unbearable uncertainty. Why did one child survive winter while another died suddenly beside the fire? Why were some families repeatedly struck by loss while others were spared? No single explanation could answer those questions then, just as none fully can now. Some archaeologists suggest child burials may have served important social functions within grieving communities. Shared mourning rituals strengthened emotional bonds between survivors. The burial itself became a collective act of care, reaffirming that the group endured despite tragedy. In small bands where every relationship mattered intensely, maintaining emotional cohesion after loss may have been essential for survival. And still, across the archaeological record, certain graves remain heartbreakingly personal. A child buried clutching animal remains. An infant wrapped carefully beneath ochre-stained soil. Tiny footprints preserved near burial pits before being frozen or buried forever. These fragments survive while nearly everything else disappears. The parents are gone. Their language vanished. Their songs dissolved into silence thousands of years ago. Yet beneath cave floors, river terraces, and ancient campsites, the graves of children still remain. They remind us that prehistoric hunters were not emotionally distant figures wandering empty landscapes. They loved, feared, protected, and mourned in ways still recognizable today. And perhaps nowhere is that more visible than in the care they gave to the smallest among them after death arrived too early. In some prehistoric graves, the dead appear peaceful. Bodies lie curled beneath ochre-stained earth with tools resting nearby and limbs carefully arranged as though sleep has simply deepened into silence. But elsewhere across the ancient world, archaeologists encounter something far stranger. Skeletons missing their skulls. Bones separated deliberately from bodies. Human remains stacked, rearranged, painted, or carried long after flesh disappeared. These discoveries hint that for many ancient hunter societies, burial was not always the final stage of death. Sometimes the dead returned. At first glance, detached skulls appear almost everywhere in prehistoric archaeology. Some were clearly disturbed accidentally over thousands of years by erosion, scavengers, floods, or later burials. Yet other cases show unmistakable signs of intentional human handling. Heads were removed carefully, bones were cleaned. Certain skulls display polishing, plastering, carving, or repeated contact after decomposition. The pattern emerges across different regions and eras strongly enough that archaeologists increasingly believe some prehistoric communities maintained long relationships with the dead rather than severing contact permanently through burial alone. The emotional implications are unsettling. A hunter dies during winter and is buried near the edge of camp. Months or years later, surviving relatives reopen the grave. Flesh has vanished. The skull is removed carefully and carried away while the rest of the skeleton remains behind. The head may then travel with the group, rest inside a shelter, or appear in ceremonies involving memory, ancestry, or spiritual protection. No written explanation survives. Only the bones remain. At the Neolithic site of Jericho, dating several thousand years after the Ice Age hunter world, but still preserving older traditions, archaeologists uncovered plastered human skulls buried beneath house floors. Faces had been reconstructed using plaster, with shells placed where eyes once existed. These eerie objects suggest ancestors remained symbolically present within daily life. Though Jericho belonged to an early agricultural society rather than mobile hunters, many scholars suspect such practices evolved from far older traditions rooted in prehistoric relationships with the dead. Even earlier evidence appears among hunter-gatherers themselves. At sites across Upper Paleolithic Europe, skulls sometimes show treatment different from the rest of the skeleton. Certain caves contain isolated crania placed deliberately in niches or chambers separate from bodies. In other locations, human bones appear mixed with animal remains in ways difficult to interpret cleanly. Scholars still debate whether these patterns reflect ancestor veneration, ritual cannibalism, warfare trophies, or funerary practices now impossible to fully reconstruct. One famous and deeply controversial example comes from Guf's cave. Around 15,000 years ago, Magdalenian hunter-gatherers occupied the cave during the Late Ice Age. Archaeologists later uncovered human bones bearing cut marks consistent with defleshing and marrow extraction. Most unsettling of all, several skulls have been modified into cup-like forms, sometimes called skull cups. The edges were carefully shaped after death, suggesting intentional craftsmanship rather than random breakage. Interpretations remain fiercely debated. Some researchers argue the evidence points toward survival cannibalism during periods of severe hardship. Others believe the treatment carried ritual significance tied to ancestor reverence or symbolic consumption of the dead. Ethnographic parallels from later societies show that ritual cannibalism, while disturbing to modern sensibilities, sometimes reflected respect rather than cruelty. Consuming parts of the dead could symbolize incorporation of memory, strength, or spiritual essence into the living community. Still, the evidence remains incomplete. Archaeology can reveal what happened physically to bones, but not always why. And prehistoric people almost certainly held beliefs about death very different from those of modern societies. Among many later traditional cultures, the dead were not viewed as entirely gone after burial. Spirits lingered. Ancestors influenced weather, fertility, hunting luck, illness, or protection. The boundary between living and dead remained porous. Scholars caution against projecting recent belief systems directly backward into deep prehistory, yet the repeated handling of ancient human remains strongly suggests ongoing social relationships with the dead. Some archaeologists describe this as secondary burial, where bodies undergo multiple stages of funerary treatment. A corpse might first decompose naturally before bones were collected and relocated later, in tropical or temperate climates where decomposition occurred quickly. Communities may have intentionally revisited remains after flesh disappeared. Bones became durable symbols of identity long after soft tissue vanished. Skulls held particular power. The human face defines individuality more than any other body part. Even after death, a skull remains unmistakably human. Eye sockets, teeth, and jawlines preserve traces of personality. Ancient people likely recognized this emotional impact just as strongly as modern observers do. Carrying or displaying skulls may therefore have preserved social presence in a tangible way. Ancestors remained physically visible. At several sites in the Levant and Anatolia, skulls appear grouped together beneath homes or inside communal spaces. Some were painted or coated with plaster. Others show evidence of repeated handling. These practices belong mostly to early farming societies. Yet many researchers believe they reflect older traditions inherited from hunter-gatherer ancestors who already viewed the dead as active participants in social life. The relationship between fear and reverence may also have shaped these customs. Human remains possess undeniable psychological force. Even today, ancient skeletons provoke fascination and discomfort simultaneously. For prehistoric people living close to death, bones may have carried both protective and dangerous associations. A skull could represent wisdom, memory, lineage, or spiritual authority. It could also symbolize contamination, haunting, or unresolved grief. No single explanation fully accounts for the enormous variation visible across prehistoric burial practices. In some societies, the dead appear hidden carefully underground and left undisturbed. In others, bones circulated openly among the living. Certain groups cremated remains. Others exposed bodies to scavengers before collecting bones later. Some graves emphasize individuality, while others merge multiple people together inside communal chambers. These differences reveal that prehistoric humanity was never culturally uniform. Beliefs about death evolved constantly across landscapes, climates, and generations. Yet one pattern emerges repeatedly. The dead continued mattering. Their bodies were manipulated carefully long after biological death. Their bones remained emotionally significant. Their skulls sometimes became objects of memory or ritual. This suggests prehistoric humans increasingly understood identity as something extending beyond physical survival itself. Imagine a small hunter band returning to a burial cave years after a respected elder died. The group enters with torches while shadows ripple against damp stone walls. Children who never met the dead hear stories whispered in flickering light. Somewhere within the chamber rests a skull wrapped in hide or decorated with pigment. It is no longer merely bone. It represents continuity, authority, fear, protection, the invisible connection between generations struggling to survive in unforgiving landscapes. Outside, winter winds sweep across the plains exactly as they did when the elder first died. Inside the cave, the dead remain present. And for ancient hunters, that presence may have shaped daily life far more deeply than modern societies can easily imagine. Death rarely arrived at convenient moments. A hunter collapses far from shelter after falling through river ice. A woman dies during migration while the group follows reindeer across open tundra. A child succumbs to fever in the middle of a dry season crossing where waterholes are already shrinking. In prehistoric life, people often died while moving through enormous landscapes that offered little safety and almost no permanence. Yet the archaeological record suggests ancient hunters frequently refused to abandon their dead where they fell. Instead, they carried them. The physical difficulty of transporting a human body across prehistoric terrain is almost unimaginable by modern standards. Even a small adult becomes extraordinarily heavy after death. Without wagons, pack animals, or roads, every mile depended entirely on human strength. Hunters already exhausted from travel now faced additional burdens while racing against weather, scavengers, and decomposition itself. Still, what survives in the record suggests that many groups made the effort anyway. The problem became especially severe in Ice Age environments. During glacial periods, hunter-gatherers moved constantly across territories shaped by cold winds, unstable game migrations, and seasonal scarcity. Camps were temporary. Shelters consisted of hides, mammoth bones, brush structures, or caves occupied only part of the year. A sudden death during migration forced immediate decisions. Should the group stop and bury the dead nearby, carry the body to a sacred location, leave someone behind to mourn, or continue moving before hunger endangered everyone else? No single solution existed. Different societies almost certainly responded in radically different ways depending on terrain, climate, season, and belief. In Arctic and subarctic environments, frozen ground itself created extraordinary challenges. Digging graves through permafrost using stone tools could require enormous labour. Some ethnographic evidence from more recent northern hunter societies suggests bodies were occasionally exposed temporarily above ground, wrapped in hides, placed on platforms, or protected with stones until burial became possible later. Archaeological evidence from deep prehistory remains fragmentary, but similar practical realities almost certainly shaped Ice Age funerary decisions. And decomposition created urgency. In warmer regions, bodies changed rapidly within hours or days. Ancient hunters knew this intimately through animal butchery and exposure to natural death. The smell of decay attracted predators from long distances. Flies arrived quickly, soft tissues broke down under heat. Carrying a decomposing body during migration would have been physically and emotionally difficult. Yet some groups appear to have transported remains over remarkable distances regardless. At sites across Upper Paleolithic Europe, certain burials contain materials originating far from the grave location itself. Marine shells carried inland, stone types imported across mountain ranges, pigments sourced from distant mineral deposits. These objects reveal extensive mobility and long-distance movement among prehistoric hunters. In some cases, scholars suspect the dead themselves may also have been transported intentionally back toward ancestral territories or significant ritual locations. The body did not simply belong to the place of death. It belonged to the group. This idea may have carried enormous emotional importance in nomadic societies. Mobile hunter-gatherers often lacked permanent architecture or fixed settlements. Memory instead attached itself to roots, seasonal camps, caves, rivers, and burial places revisited across generations. Returning the dead to specific locations could reinforce group identity and continuity within constantly shifting landscapes. Some archaeologists believe repeated use of burial grounds by mobile groups helped create early forms of territorial belonging. Ancestors anchored communities geographically even when daily life remained nomadic. Certain valleys, caves, or rock shelters became emotionally charged because generations of dead rested there. The living moved constantly, but the dead remained. And sometimes the journey itself became ritual. Among many later traditional societies documented historically, funerary transport involved processions, pauses, songs, offerings, or symbolic acts marking the transition between life and death. Direct comparisons to prehistory must remain cautious. Yet human psychology suggests movement with the dead likely carried emotional meaning long before organized religion emerged. Carrying a body together transformed grief into collective action. It slowed time. It forced acknowledgement of loss. Every exhausted step reinforced social bonds among survivors. Archaeologists occasionally uncover evidence hinting at such prolonged funerary journeys. At Dolny Vestonets, a remarkable Upper Paleolithic burial dating roughly 27,000 years ago contained 3 young individuals buried together beneath mammoth shoulder blades and covered with red ochre. The grave itself appears highly ritualized, and the effort required to prepare it suggests deliberate ceremonial planning rather than hurried disposal. Though the exact circumstances remain unknown, scholars suspect the burial represented a socially significant event involving extensive community participation. The emotional atmosphere surrounding such ceremonies must have been intense. Imagine a hunting band moving slowly across an open Ice Age plain beneath grey skies. Wind drives snow across the ground while distant mammoth herds move along the horizon. In the centre of the group, several individuals carry a wrapped body using poles, hides, or woven supports. Children walk silently nearby. Hunters who normally scan constantly for prey or predators now focus inward instead. Campfires that evening burn differently. Conversations quiet. The dead remain physically present among the living for days or perhaps weeks before burial finally occurs. This prolonged closeness may have shaped prehistoric ideas about identity and spirit profoundly. Modern industrial societies often separate the living from the dead quickly through hospitals, funeral homes, and institutions. Prehistoric people experienced death physically and continuously. Bodies cooled beside sleeping areas. Relatives carried corpses across landscapes. Bones resurfaced during later visits to burial sites. Children witnessed decomposition directly. The boundary between life and death therefore may have felt less sudden, but more hauntingly gradual. And there was always danger. Transporting a body slowed migration at precisely the moment survival pressures intensified. A delayed hunt could mean starvation. Remaining too long in one place risked attack from predators or rival groups. During severe winters, entire bands may have faced impossible choices between protecting the living and honouring the dead. The archaeological record rarely preserves such emotional conflicts directly, yet they must have occurred repeatedly throughout prehistory. Some deaths may simply have been impossible to manage ceremonially. Bodies lost during floods, avalanches, storms, or predator attacks may never have been recovered at all. Hunters falling through glacial crevasses disappeared forever. Coastal groups likely lost people to rough seas and tidal currents. Such absences may have influenced emerging spiritual beliefs just as strongly as formal burials did. When no body remained, memory itself became the only grave. In other cases, partial remains were transported instead of whole bodies. Secondary burial practices involving cleaned bones or selected skeletal parts appear in multiple prehistoric contexts. This may partly reflect the practical difficulty of moving entire corpses long distances. A body could decompose temporarily at the place of death before important bones, especially skulls, were carried later to ancestral sites or communal burial caves. Again and again, prehistoric funerary behavior reveals one central truth. Ancient hunters often refused to let death erase social belonging immediately. The dead continued traveling with the living, sometimes literally across mountains, plains, forests, and frozen rivers. Mourning unfolded not only beside graves but during movement itself. Every journey carrying the dead became part survival struggle, part emotional ritual, and part attempt to hold communities together against the immense instability of prehistoric life. The landscape remembered these journeys even when no visible trace survived. A valley where a child was buried during migration, a cave reached after carrying an elder through winter storms, a ridge where hunters paused to rest beside the wrapped body of a companion before continuing onward. Thousands of years later, wind still moves across those same places, and somewhere beneath stone, ice, or earth, the dead remain where ancient hunters finally chose to stop carrying them. Among the oldest graves in human history, a few contain an unexpected presence. Not another hunter, not a child wrapped beside a parent, but an animal placed carefully near the dead as though it, too, belonged within the ritual world of mourning. Sometimes the remains lie beside human bodies directly. Sometimes they rest at the feet, near the hands, or within the same burial pit. These discoveries are rare, but when they appear, they reveal something remarkable about the emotional lives of ancient hunters. Humans were not grieving alone. For most of prehistory, animals represented survival. Hunters tracked them, feared them, followed them across continents, and depended on them for meat, clothing, bone tools, shelter coverings, and fuel. Predator attacks remained a constant threat. Large herbivores could kill with a single strike, yet certain animals slowly crossed an invisible boundary. They ceased being merely prey or danger and became companions. And death rituals preserve some of the earliest evidence of that transformation. One of the most famous examples comes from Bonobo Castle, where archaeologists uncovered a burial dating to roughly 14,000 years ago, near the end of the Ice Age. Inside the grave rested the remains of a man, a woman, and a dog buried together. The dog had suffered from severe illness during life, likely canine distemper, yet survived long enough to require extended human care. Researchers concluded that people must have fed and protected the animal through repeated periods of weakness when it could no longer function effectively. That detail matters enormously. Caring for a sick dog consumed time, food, and energy in a world where every resource mattered. The animal survived because humans chose compassion over strict practicality, and when death finally came, the dog was buried alongside humans rather than discarded separately. The emotional implications feel unmistakable even after 14,000 years. The relationship between humans and dogs may be among the most important alliances in evolutionary history. Scholars still debate exactly when wolves first began transforming into domesticated companions. Genetic evidence suggests a long and complicated process unfolding across thousands of years. Some wolves likely scavenged near human campsites. Certain animals gradually became more tolerant of people. Humans, in turn, recognized the advantages of cooperation. Dogs could detect predators, track prey, assist hunts, and provide warmth or warning during dangerous nights. But burial reveals something deeper than utility. It suggests attachment. At several prehistoric sites across Eurasia and the Americas, dogs appear intentionally buried either alone or beside humans. Some graves contain ornaments, ochre, or careful positioning similar to human burials. The treatment varies widely, and no single explanation fully accounts for every case. Certain dogs may have held practical importance as hunting partners. Others perhaps symbolize status, protection, or spiritual guidance. Yet the repeated care visible in these burials strongly implies emotional bonds recognizable even today. Imagine the realities of Ice Age hunting life from the perspective of companionship. Small bands traveled through vast, dangerous landscapes where loneliness itself could become psychologically crushing. Winter darkness lasted for long periods in northern regions. Predator sounds circled camps at night. Hunters depended constantly on cooperation and vigilance. A loyal dog sleeping near the fire provided more than assistance during hunts. It offered familiarity, warning, warmth, and social connection in environments shaped by uncertainty. When such an animal died, grief may have followed naturally. At Uyun al-Hammam, archaeologists uncovered a burial roughly 16,500 years old, containing human remains associated with a fox burial nearby. The fox appears to have been intentionally interred, and evidence suggests its remains may even have been moved together with a human burial at some point. The discovery predates widespread dog domestication and hints that prehistoric emotional relationships with animals may have been more varied than once believed. Foxes, wolves, birds, bears, and other creatures likely occupied powerful symbolic roles within hunter societies. Humans observed animal behavior constantly because survival depended on it. Certain species became associated with intelligence, endurance, migration, danger, or mystery. Some anthropologists believe early spiritual traditions emerged partly from this deep observational relationship between humans and animals. Death rituals reveal those connections vividly. In several Upper Paleolithic graves, animal teeth, antlers, claws, or bones accompany the dead. Sometimes these objects likely served as ornaments or symbols of hunting skill. In other cases, they may represent spiritual associations now impossible to fully reconstruct. A child buried wearing fox teeth ornaments, an elder resting beneath mammoth bones, hunters placed with antlers near their heads. The boundary between human and animal worlds appears psychologically porous in prehistoric ritual life. This makes sense within hunter-gatherer existence. Unlike agricultural societies that later dominated landscapes, prehistoric hunters lived directly inside animal ecosystems rather than above them. Herd migrations determined human movement. Predator behavior shaped campsite selection. Seasonal cycles followed breeding patterns and environmental change. Humans were participants inside larger ecological systems, not masters separate from them. Animals therefore occupied emotional and symbolic spaces far more intimate than modern industrial societies often experience. And some animals may have been viewed as companions after death as well as during life. Later traditional societies recorded historically sometimes imagined dogs guiding souls, protecting spirits, or accompanying the dead into other realms. Scholars remain cautious about applying such beliefs directly to deep prehistory, yet the recurring presence of animals in graves suggests symbolic meanings extending beyond simple ownership. Burial transformed animals into participants within human memory and ritual. The emotional complexity of these relationships becomes especially visible in cases involving deliberate care for aging or injured animals. At Bonnerba Castle, the sick dog's survival required prolonged nursing. Similar evidence appears at other sites where dogs with healed injuries lived long after they would likely have died without human support. These animals were not treated merely as disposable tools. They became members of social groups, and that social inclusion continued after death. Some archaeologists believe animal burials may also have helped prehistoric hunters process grief itself. The death of a hunting companion could affect daily survival directly. Dogs contributed to tracking, protection, and mobility. Losing one disrupted emotional routines and practical cooperation simultaneously. Burial rituals may therefore have acknowledged both companionship and functional loss. Yet the evidence remains incomplete and deeply fragmentary. Many animal remains found near human burials could reflect food offerings, scavenging intrusion, symbolic deposition, or coincidence rather than companionship in any modern sense. Archaeologists must constantly separate careful interpretation from emotional projection. The temptation to see modern pet relationships reflected in ancient graves is powerful, but not always reliable. Still, some discoveries resist purely practical explanations. A carefully buried dog beside humans. A fox moved with ritual attention. Animals receiving treatment remarkably similar to people themselves. These moments hint that ancient hunters expanded their emotional world beyond the boundaries of their own species long before civilization emerged. Picture a cold evening near the end of the Ice Age. Snow drifts against hide shelters while hunters gather beside a shallow grave. Wrapped within hides lies not only a dead companion, but the old dog that once slept beside the fire every night. Children remember its warning barks during storms. Hunters remember its tracks beside theirs in fresh snow. Someone places a hand briefly against its fur before the burial pit is closed. The living stand silently together while darkness spreads across the plain. And beneath the earth, human and animal enter memory side by side. The graves themselves are only part of the story. Around many prehistoric burial sites, archaeologists discover something else scattered through the soil: broken animal bones split for marrow, charcoal from large fires, stone tools abandoned after heavy use, fragments of cups or containers, clusters of butchered meat remains. At first glance, these traces appear ordinary, the debris of daily survival left behind accidentally by hunters camping nearby. But in some places the concentration and arrangement suggest something more deliberate. The living gathered beside the dead. Death in prehistoric societies rarely seems silent for long. Mourning drew people together physically in worlds where isolation could be fatal. Small hunter bands dispersed seasonally across enormous territories. Yet funerary rituals often created moments of temporary reunion. Relatives arrived from neighboring groups. Fires burned through the night. Food was shared. Stories were repeated beside graves while children listened carefully. These gatherings likely served emotional purposes far beyond grief alone. They reinforced alliances, renewed social bonds, exchanged knowledge, and stabilized communities shaken by loss. In many ways, death may have been one of the oldest reasons humans assembled in large numbers. The archaeological evidence remains subtle because feasts leave messy traces difficult to separate from ordinary life. A pile of animal bones near a grave does not automatically prove ceremonial activity. Hunters everywhere butchered meat, cracked bones for fat, and discarded waste around campsites. Yet at certain prehistoric locations, unusual concentrations of food remains appear directly associated with funerary spaces strongly enough to suggest communal gatherings centered around death rituals. At the massive Neolithic ritual complex of Göbekli Tepe, large quantities of animal bones indicate repeated communal consumption on a scale far beyond ordinary daily meals. Göbekli Tepe belongs to a later era than the Paleolithic hunter world, standing near the threshold of agriculture roughly 11,000 years ago, yet it may preserve older traditions inherited from mobile foraging societies. Monumental stone pillars carved with animals surround spaces that many scholars interpret as ceremonial gathering areas. Human remains at the site appear fragmentary and unusual, including modified skull pieces suggesting ritual treatment of the dead. No single explanation fully accounts for the site. Scholars still debate whether it functioned primarily as a ritual centre, seasonal gathering place, mortuary landscape, or combination of many purposes. But what emerges clearly is that communal feasting and death rituals may already have been deeply connected. Food transformed grief into collective experience. This pattern appears repeatedly across human history, because eating together stabilizes social groups during periods of emotional stress. Shared meals reduce tension, reaffirm belonging, and redistribute resources. Prehistoric hunters likely discovered these effects through lived experience rather than conscious theory. After a death, people needed one another more intensely. Feasting beside graves may therefore have helped prevent fragmentation inside small, vulnerable communities. Imagine the atmosphere surrounding such gatherings. A burial has just taken place near the edge of a river valley used seasonally for generations. Smoke rises from multiple fires while hunters butcher freshly killed animals nearby. The dead rest beneath stones and ochre-stained soil only meters away. Children move cautiously among adults speaking in lowered voices. Meat roasts over open flames while marrow fat crackles into the fire. Some mourn openly, others remain withdrawn and silent. Yet the group eats together because survival still depends on cooperation tomorrow morning. The feast becomes part mourning, part reassurance. We are still here. Archaeological evidence from some Upper Paleolithic sites suggests particularly large animals may occasionally have been consumed during important funerary events. Mammoths, bison, aurochs, and other massive prey required coordinated group hunts involving considerable danger and labour. Their meat could feed many people at once, making them ideal for communal gatherings at several prehistoric sites. Enormous quantities of animal remains cluster around ritual areas, in ways suggesting organised consumption beyond everyday subsistence. Scholars remain cautious because interpretation is difficult. Large gatherings may have occurred for seasonal migrations, mating exchanges, alliance formation, or successful hunts unrelated to death. Yet funerary rituals likely overlapped with all these activities. In small-scale societies, major emotional events often become opportunities for wider social interaction. And the emotional intensity of mourning may have strengthened memory itself. Stories told beside graves helped preserve identities long after bodies decomposed. A child hearing repeated accounts of a dead hunter's bravery learns not only family history but group values. Shared meals created environments where oral traditions flourished. Around prehistoric fires, memory passed from one generation into another through repetition tied directly to loss and survival. Some anthropologists believe funerary feasting may even have contributed to the development of increasingly complex human social structures. Hosting gatherings required planning, food sharing, cooperation, and reciprocal obligation. Communities capable of organizing large mourning rituals strengthen networks extending beyond immediate family units. Over thousands of years, such practices may have helped lay foundations for larger tribal identities and eventually more permanent settlements. Death therefore shaped the living politically as well as emotionally. There is another darker layer to these gatherings too. In many later human societies, funerary feasts served not only to honour the dead, but also to manage fear surrounding death itself. Eating, singing, storytelling, and ritual action counteracted the psychological instability caused by loss. Ancient hunters, living in landscapes filled with sudden violence, starvation, and disease, may have needed such communal reassurance intensely. The feast reminded survivors that life continued despite the grave nearby. At some sites, evidence suggests fires burned unusually long or repeatedly near burial areas. Ash deposits accumulate beside graves alongside animal remains and broken tools. Certain caves containing burials also show prolonged occupation or ritual reuse over generations. The dead did not disappear quickly from community awareness. Mourning unfolded over time through repeated gatherings and acts of remembrance. And not every gathering was peaceful. Large funerary assemblies may also have carried risks. Rival groups interacted uneasily. Tensions over territory, resources, or alliances could surface during emotionally charged ceremonies. Archaeological evidence from later prehistoric periods increasingly reveals violence, trauma, and conflict intertwined with ritual life. Death gatherings brought people together, but they also concentrated emotion, memory, and social pressure in dangerous ways. Still, what survives most strongly is the sense of collective presence. A grave alone can feel isolated and silent, but scattered around many prehistoric burials are traces of movement, fire, food, and repeated human activity. The dead were rarely abandoned privately. Communities gathered physically around loss. Picture an evening near the close of the Ice Age. Fires burn beneath a sky filled with stars sharper than any visible in modern polluted cities. Hunters sit close together wrapped in animal hides while meat cooks slowly over coals. Nearby rests the fresh grave of someone whose absence still feels unreal. Smoke drifts through cold air carrying the smell of fat, earth, and pine resin. Children fall asleep beside elders still telling stories in low voices. Beyond the firelight, wolves move through darkness. But inside the circle of warmth and food, the living hold tightly to one another. And for ancient hunters facing the constant fragility of survival, that gathering itself may have been one of the deepest rituals of all. Not every prehistoric death ritual was gentle. Beneath the romantic image of ancient hunters gathered solemnly around graves lies a darker archaeological reality that continues to divide researchers even today. In caves, river terraces, and ancient campsites across the world, human bones sometimes appear broken apart like animal remains. Skulls are opened, long bones are cracked for marrow, teeth bear cut marks from stone blades. Flesh was removed deliberately. In certain sites, human bodies seem to have been processed with the same practical precision used during butchery after a successful hunt. The question that follows is deeply uncomfortable. Were prehistoric humans eating one another? The answer, increasingly, appears to be yes, at least sometimes. But why they did so remains one of the most emotionally charged debates in archaeology. Cannibalism carries enormous symbolic weight in modern societies. It evokes horror, desperation, taboo, and moral collapse. Yet prehistoric evidence suggests human consumption occurred under many different circumstances across vast spans of time. Some episodes likely emerge from starvation during ecological catastrophe. Others may have involved warfare, ritual practices, ancestor reverence, or social violence. No single explanation fully accounts for the diversity of evidence scattered across the prehistoric world. And archaeologists must proceed carefully, because the line between ritual treatment and practical survival is often painfully difficult to define. At Gough's Cave, the evidence remains among the clearest and most disturbing. Around 15,000 years ago, Magdalenian hunter-gatherers occupying the cave processed human remains using techniques strikingly similar to those applied to hunted animals. Bones show cut marks from defleshing. Marrow was extracted deliberately. Some skulls were shaped into carefully modified cups after death. Researchers analysing the remains concluded that the treatment likely involved nutritional cannibalism combined with ritual behaviour. That combination matters. Modern assumptions often separate survival cannibalism from ceremonial activity, as though they belong to entirely different emotional worlds. But prehistoric societies may not have recognised such strict boundaries. A body could simultaneously represent food, ancestor, enemy, memory, or spiritual force depending on cultural context. Consumption itself may have carried symbolic meaning far beyond nutrition. At another site, Grandolina, researchers uncovered evidence suggesting human ancestors consumed other humans roughly 800,000 years ago. The remains belonged to Homo antecessor, an early human species. Bones displayed cut marks, percussion fractures, and butchery patterns nearly identical to nearby animal remains. Scholars debate whether the behavior reflected organized predation, scavenging, territorial violence, or nutritional opportunism during periods of scarcity. Regardless of motive, the evidence indicates cannibalism reaches extraordinarily deep into human evolutionary history. This realization changes how death itself must be understood in prehistoric environments. In modern industrial societies, death is heavily separated from survival needs. Bodies are protected legally, morally, and institutionally. Prehistoric hunters lived inside ecological systems where starvation remained a constant threat. During severe winters, droughts, failed migrations, or environmental collapse, the distinction between taboo and necessity could become dangerously thin. The Late Ice Age especially brought periods of extreme instability. Sudden climate shifts transformed ecosystems rapidly. Herd animals vanished from familiar territories. Glacial conditions intensified unpredictably. Entire human populations sometimes disappeared regionally or migrated enormous distances in response to environmental pressure. Under such conditions, survival cannibalism may occasionally have emerged during catastrophic food shortages, yet starvation alone cannot explain every case. Certain sites show evidence of highly structured treatment of human remains inconsistent with desperate emergency consumption. Skulls modified into ceremonial objects, bones arranged carefully after defleshing, selective processing focused on particular body parts. These patterns suggest symbolic systems surrounding death and the body that modern observers struggle to fully reconstruct. Some anthropologists studying later traditional societies documented forms of ritual cannibalism connected not to cruelty, but to grief and remembrance. In certain cultures, consuming small portions of cremated or processed remains symbolized incorporation of the dead into the living community. Elsewhere, enemy consumption represented domination or transfer of strength. These practices varied enormously and should not be projected simplistically backward into prehistory. Still, they demonstrate that human societies have attached radically different meanings to bodily treatment after death. What seems horrifying in one cultural framework may appear sacred in another. This does not mean prehistoric cannibalism was peaceful or symbolic in every case. Far from it. Archaeological evidence also points toward violence, massacre, and social conflict in some prehistoric contexts involving human remains. At several Neolithic and later prehistoric sites, groups of individuals show signs of trauma, dismemberment, or violent death associated with unusual bone processing. Scholars still debate how often warfare occurred among early hunter-gatherers, but evidence increasingly suggests organized violence was not rare. Death rituals could therefore become entangled with revenge, fear, or domination. Imagine a small hunting band entering another group's territory during a harsh winter after game populations collapse. Tensions escalate near a river crossing or seasonal campsite. Violence erupts suddenly. Survivors face impossible decisions afterward in landscapes already stripped of resources. Under such circumstances, practical necessity and emotional brutality might blend together in ways modern societies find difficult to comprehend. The archaeological record preserves only fragments of these moments. Cut marks on bone, fractured skulls, ash layers beside scattered remains. The emotional realities behind them vanished long ago. And yet, scholars remain cautious about overinterpreting evidence of cannibalism because human remains can become damaged through many processes after burial. Animal scavenging, erosion, cave collapse, and accidental breakage sometimes mimic patterns associated with butchery. Archaeologists therefore rely on combinations of evidence rather than isolated marks. Consistent tool cuts near muscle attachments, deliberate marrow extraction patterns, burning traces, and parallels with animal processing strengthen interpretations considerably. Even then, uncertainty remains. No single explanation fully accounts for why humans repeatedly cross such profound boundaries surrounding the dead. Perhaps that uncertainty itself reflects something essential about prehistoric life. Ancient hunters existed inside environments where death constantly blurred categories. Modern societies prefer to keep separate food, ritual, memory, violence, grief, and survival intertwined continuously. A body could represent loved one and resource simultaneously during ecological catastrophe. Mourning itself may have unfolded through practices now emotionally alien to modern observers. And still, despite the unsettling evidence, one broader pattern persists across prehistory. Most human dead were not treated as meat. The overwhelming majority of known burials show care, symbolism, protection, or ritual handling rather than simple consumption. Cannibalism appears episodic, culturally variable, and context-dependent rather than universal. That distinction matters enormously. The same species capable of consuming human flesh during crisis or ritual was also capable of burying children with tenderness, carrying bodies across frozen plains, and preserving skulls as ancestral relics. Human responses to death were never singular. They range from compassion to terror, reverence to practicality, grief to violence. Prehistoric burial grounds preserve all these emotions layered together beneath the earth. Deep inside a cave during a starving winter, fires burn low while exhausted hunters sit beside butchered remains they never imagined consuming. Somewhere else, in another century, mourners shape a skull carefully into a ritual vessel meant to preserve memory rather than erase it. Across thousands of generations, humanity searches for ways to confront the unbearable reality of death. Sometimes with tenderness, sometimes with fear, and sometimes with acts so unsettling that even now, tens of thousands of years later, the bones still disturb those who uncover them. Over time, the dead began occupying more than graves. They entered stories, landscapes, migrations, and decisions made by the living. A valley stopped being merely a place where reindeer crossed each autumn, because an elder now rested beneath its soil. A cave became dangerous or sacred because generations of bones remained inside. Hunters travelling across familiar ground no longer moved only through forests, rivers, and plains. They moved through memory. and memory slowly transformed the dead into ancestors. This shift may have altered human society as profoundly as fire or language. Once the dead were imagined as continuing to matter after burial, entire landscapes acquired emotional depth impossible to see physically. Invisible relationships stretched backward through generations. The living inherited obligations to people they would never meet. Burial places became anchors tying communities to territory long before cities or kingdoms existed. What survives in the archaeological record suggests this transformation unfolded gradually and unevenly across thousands of years. There was no single moment when humanity suddenly invented ancestor belief. Different groups likely developed different ideas shaped by environment, mobility, social structure, and historical experience. Yet repeated patterns begin emerging across prehistoric sites, graves revisited over generations, bones curated carefully, skulls preserved, burial grounds reused continuously, and ritual spaces maintained long after original mourners died. The dead were no longer disappearing completely. They remained socially active, at sites associated with later hunter-gatherers and early sedentary communities. Archaeologists increasingly find evidence that human remains influence the organization of living space itself. Burials appear beneath homes, near hearths, beside pathways, or inside communal gathering areas. The placement suggests ancestors remained woven into everyday existence rather than isolated in distant cemeteries. One striking example comes from Sat al-Huyuk, a large Neolithic settlement dating roughly 9,000 years ago. Although it belongs to the dawn of farming rather than purely mobile hunting life, many researchers believe its burial customs preserve older traditions rooted in prehistoric forager societies. Residents buried their dead beneath house floors directly inside living spaces. Over generations, homes accumulated layers of ancestors beneath sleeping platforms and hearths. Some skulls were removed later, plastered, painted, or displayed separately. The emotional atmosphere must have been extraordinary. Families slept above generations of dead relatives while fires burned only feet away from buried bones. Children grew up literally surrounded by ancestral presence. Every house became both shelter and tomb. Yet ancestor relationships likely emerged long before permanent settlements. Mobile hunter-gatherers also revisited important burial locations repeatedly across generations. Certain caves, river valleys, coastlines, and rock shelters preserve evidence of long-term ritual continuity extending thousands of years. Groups returned seasonally to places where their dead rested, reinforcing collective identity through repetition and memory. Anthropologists studying later hunter-gatherer societies have often observed that ancestors serve practical as well as spiritual functions. They legitimize territorial claims, regulate social behavior, preserve oral history, and strengthen cooperation within groups. Scholars remain cautious about projecting recent ethnographic patterns directly into deep prehistory, but similar social pressures almost certainly existed among ancient hunters. Small communities competing for resources benefited from shared identities rooted in ancestry and place. The dead helped organize the living. Imagine a hunting band approaching a familiar valley at the beginning of migration season. Elders remember previous winters there. Stories describe ancient hunts, storms, births, and deaths tied to specific landmarks. Nearby caves contain ancestral burials visited for generations. The group does not experience the landscape as empty wilderness. It feels inhabited by memory. That emotional geography may have shaped human behavior profoundly. Some archaeologists believe ancestor traditions contributed to increasing territorial attachment during the late Paleolithic and early Holocene periods. As climate stabilized after the Ice Age, certain hunter-gatherer groups became less mobile and more invested in productive regions rich in fish, game, or plant resources. Burial grounds reinforced claims to those landscapes emotionally and socially. Ancestors resting in a territory symbolized continuity and belonging. This process may even help explain why prehistoric burial practices often became more elaborate over time. The dead represented identity. A respected elder buried carefully near a seasonal camp linked future generations to that place. Revisiting the grave renewed collective memory. Stories attached themselves to bones and locations simultaneously. Oral tradition and physical landscape merged together into enduring cultural systems. And ancestors were not always comforting. Many traditional societies documented historically viewed ancestral spirits as powerful, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous if neglected. Ritual obligations maintained balance between living and dead. Graves required attention, offerings were left. Certain places became taboo or sacred. Again, direct comparisons with prehistory remain uncertain, but archaeological evidence strongly suggests ancient humans often treated ancestral remains with a mixture of reverence and caution. This duality appears clearly in skull cult practices found across multiple prehistoric regions. Human skulls preserved separately from bodies may have functioned as ancestral objects retaining social power after death. Displayed within homes or ceremonial spaces, they blurred boundaries between presence and absence. The dead remained physically visible. At several sites in the Levant, plastered skulls appear positioned carefully beneath house floors or inside ritual contexts. Though these belong primarily to early agricultural societies, many scholars suspect they reflect much older psychological patterns inherited from foraging ancestors. The face preserved identity. Ancestors continued watching over the living community. The implications are haunting. A child growing up in such a society would never experience death as complete disappearance. Stories, bones, rituals, and landscapes continually reinforced ancestral continuity. The dead shaped decisions about movement, marriage, hunting territories, alliances, and social conduct. They became part of the invisible structure holding communities together across generations. And this continuity may have offered profound psychological comfort in dangerous worlds. Prehistoric life was unstable. Climate shifted unpredictably. Epidemics, starvation, injury, and violence could erase entire groups quickly. Ancestors provided a sense of permanence against that instability. Even if individuals died, the group endured through memory and lineage. Burial rituals transformed fragile human lives into enduring narratives tied to land itself. No single explanation fully accounts for the emergence of ancestor belief, because prehistoric minds remain inaccessible. Yet the archaeological pattern becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss. Humans repeatedly returned to their dead, preserved certain remains carefully, reused burial grounds across centuries, and integrated ancestral presence into social landscapes. The dead became part of survival. Picture a windswept valley near the close of the Ice Age. Hunters gather beside old graves partly hidden beneath grass and stone. Children listen while elders point toward distant hills, where ancestors once tracked mammoths across snowfields, now vanished beneath warmer forests. Fires burn low as stories pass from memory into memory. Nearby rests the skull of a respected elder wrapped carefully in hide and ochre. Outside the circle of firelight, darkness spreads across the land. But inside, the living do not feel entirely alone. The dead remain with them in the caves, beneath the earth, inside the stories, and within every path the hunters continue walking across the ancient world. Not every grave tells a story of peaceful mourning. Some prehistoric burials reveal terror frozen into bone, crushed skulls, embedded spear points, fractured ribs, defensive wounds etched into forearms raised instinctively against attack. In certain graves, bodies lie twisted together hastily as though death arrived too suddenly for ritual care. Others show signs of binding, execution, or violent sacrifice. These discoveries expose a darker truth about ancient hunter societies. Death rituals did not exist separately from fear, conflict, and power. They often emerged directly from them. For much of the 20th century, prehistoric hunter-gatherers were sometimes imagined as relatively peaceful people, living in balance with nature before the rise of agriculture and organized warfare. That image has steadily eroded under growing archaeological evidence. Violence appears repeatedly across prehistoric human remains, stretching far back into the Paleolithic world. Individual murders, ambushes, territorial clashes, raids, and perhaps even massacres left physical traces that still survive thousands of years later. And the dead carried those stories into the grave. At the cemetery site of Jebel Sahaba, archaeologists uncovered one of the oldest known examples of sustained human conflict. Dating roughly 13,000 years ago near the end of the Ice Age, the cemetery contains individuals bearing numerous injuries from stone projectiles and close-range violence. Arrow points and spear fragments remained embedded in bones. Some skeletons showed healed injuries from earlier attacks, suggesting repeated episodes of conflict rather than a single isolated massacre. The timing matters enormously. Around this period, dramatic climate fluctuations transformed landscapes across North Africa and the Near East. Rivers shifted, resources became unstable. Human groups concentrated around shrinking habitable regions. Scholars increasingly suspect environmental stress intensified territorial competition among late hunter-gatherer populations. No single explanation fully accounts for the violence at Jebel Sahaba, but the evidence suggests communities living through ecological instability may have faced recurring deadly conflict. And yet, despite the violence, the dead were still buried carefully. Bodies were placed deliberately within graves even after brutal deaths. This detail reveals something important about prehistoric emotional life. Ritual did not disappear during violence. If anything, violence may have made funerary practices even more socially necessary. Burial transformed chaotic death into structured memory. It reassured survivors that the group still possessed order despite fear and loss. Some graves suggest even more unsettling possibilities. At certain prehistoric sites, individuals appear buried differently from others in ways scholars interpret cautiously as evidence of punishment, sacrifice, exclusion, or social anxiety. Bodies placed face down, skeletons weighted with stones, individuals isolated from communal cemeteries, remains showing signs of restraint. The interpretations remain uncertain because burial variation can emerge from many causes, but some patterns strongly imply that not all dead were treated equally. Fear shaped funerary behavior. Across many later human societies documented historically, unusual deaths often generated special ritual responses. Victims of violence, disease, childbirth, suicide, or perceived spiritual danger might receive separate treatment because communities feared restless spirits or contamination. Archaeologists remain careful about applying such beliefs directly to prehistoric contexts, yet similar emotional pressures likely existed. Violent death disrupts social expectations profoundly. Ritual becomes a way to manage the psychological shock. At Talheim Death Pit, dating to the early Neolithic period, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave containing men, women, and children killed violently, likely during a raid or intergroup conflict. Many skulls displayed lethal blows from stone adzes. Some individuals appeared left without the careful funerary treatment visible elsewhere in the same era. Though Talheim belongs to farming societies rather than Ice Age hunters, it reveals how quickly violence could overwhelm ordinary burial customs when entire communities collapse suddenly. Similar episodes may have occurred repeatedly throughout prehistory but left little surviving evidence. Small hunter-gatherer populations rarely produce large cemeteries. Many deaths vanished without trace through scavenging, erosion, or exposure. Entire conflicts may have disappeared completely from the archaeological record. Yet scattered clues suggest violence formed a persistent background reality in many prehistoric landscapes, and death rituals often reflected that danger directly. Some burials contain weapons placed carefully beside the dead spear points, knives, clubs, arrows, or hunting tools arranged almost protectively. Scholars debate whether these objects symbolize status, identity, spiritual preparation, or practical offerings for another existence. But in dangerous worlds where conflict and predation remained constant threats, weapons also represented security, even after death. Protection mattered psychologically. At certain sites, children and adults were buried together in ways hinting at sudden catastrophe. In others, skeletons display signs of panic or hurried disposal, inconsistent with ordinary ceremonial treatment. Epidemics, starvation events, raids, floods, and environmental disasters likely forced communities into emergency responses where ritual ideals collided with survival pressure. The emotional complexity of such moments is difficult to overstate. Imagine a hunter band returning to camp after a violent attack. Fires still smoulder. Bodies lie scattered among broken tools and trampled hides. Survivors must bury relatives quickly before scavengers arrive or enemies return. Children cry while wounded adults dig graves through frozen ground. Fear hangs over the camp heavier than grief itself. Yet even then, people still pause to arrange bodies, cover faces, place tools beside the dead, or speak names one final time. Ritual persists because humans need structure most intensely during chaos. There is also evidence that certain prehistoric burials may have involved sacrifice or symbolic killing connected to status and power. Some graves contain individuals positioned unusually near high-status burials as though accompanying important figures in death. Archaeologists debate these interpretations carefully because direct evidence remains rare and ambiguous. Still, later ancient civilizations practiced forms of retainer sacrifice repeatedly, and some scholars suspect the roots of such behavior may extend deep into prehistoric social systems. If true, this reveals another unsettling dimension of funerary ritual. The dead could reinforce hierarchy as well as memory. Powerful individuals received elaborate burials while others remained anonymous. Ancestors legitimized authority. Ritual controlled emotional responses to violence. Burial customs reflected social tensions alongside compassion and grief. And sometimes the violence itself became sacred memory. A massacre site preserved beneath desert sediment. A cave holding bodies killed during territorial conflict. A burial mound where generations remember enemies long after names vanish. These places transformed into warning landscapes carrying emotional weight across centuries. Yet even amid evidence of brutality, one fact remains striking. Prehistoric humans almost always responded to violent death with meaning rather than indifference. Bodies were buried, revisited, arranged, marked, or mourned even after horrific circumstances. The ritual response itself reveals humanity's refusal to treat death as mere biological disposal. Picture a cold dawn after conflict somewhere near the close of the Ice Age. Snow falls lightly over a campsite scarred by violence. Survivors move silently among the dead, gathering broken weapons and carrying bodies towards shallow graves beside a frozen riverbank. The living are exhausted, frightened, and uncertain whether more danger waits nearby. Yet still they kneel beside the fallen carefully. The rituals continue because they must. Without them, the world would feel too chaotic to survive. Most prehistoric dead disappear completely. Flesh decays, bones crack apart under frost and heat, rivers scatter skeletons into gravel beds, scavengers drag remains across open ground until nothing recognizable survives. Entire generations vanish without leaving names, faces, or graves. Archaeology usually reconstructs the past from fragments so incomplete that certainty becomes almost impossible. But in a few rare places, nature interrupted that process. Cold, dryness, salt, peat, and darkness preserved the dead with terrifying intimacy. Instead of scattered bones, archaeologists sometimes encounter skin, hair, fingerprints, stomach contents, clothing, tattoos, and facial expressions still visible after thousands of years. These preserved bodies collapse the emotional distance between modern observers and prehistoric humanity. Suddenly the dead no longer feel abstract. They become individuals frozen at the edge of disappearance. And what they reveal about ancient funerary treatment is often haunting. In frozen mountain passes, entire bodies remained locked inside ice for millennia. Deserts preserved skin like leather beneath shifting sand. Peat bogs slowed decay so completely that faces emerge from the earth appearing almost asleep. Such preservation is accidental rather than intentional in most cases, yet it offers extraordinary insight into how prehistoric people died, travelled, dressed, ate, and were treated afterward. Perhaps the most famous example is Ötzi, the Iceman discovery site. In 1991, hikers crossing the Alps discovered the naturally mummified remains of a man who died roughly 5,300 years ago, near the border between modern Italy and Austria. Ice preserved his body, clothing, tools, and even stomach contents in astonishing detail. Researchers learned what he ate shortly before death, what illnesses he suffered, the tattoos marked across his skin, and eventually, how he died. An arrow struck him from behind. Ötzi belongs to a later world already transitioning toward farming and metallurgy. Yet his preservation reveals realities deeply connected to earlier hunter societies. He travelled dangerous mountain landscapes carrying specialized tools and survival equipment. His body remained where he died because harsh alpine conditions froze him almost immediately. Had the ice not protected him, he would likely have vanished entirely into stone and weather. Instead, he survived long enough for modern humans to meet him face to face. The emotional impact of such preservation cannot be overstated. Archaeologists accustomed to fragmented skeletons suddenly confront human features still recognizable after thousands of years. Fingernails remain attached, beard stubble survives. Expressions linger faintly across preserved skin. The dead become disturbingly present again. Bog bodies create an even stranger effect. Across northern Europe, peat bogs preserved human remains through acidic, oxygen-poor conditions that halted normal decomposition. Some bodies date to later prehistoric periods rather than the deep Paleolithic, yet they reveal important continuities in how ancient societies treated the dead. At Tollen Man Discovery Site, the body of a man dating roughly 2,400 years ago emerged from the peat with facial features almost perfectly intact. A noose still encircled his neck. His eyes remained gently closed. Stubble shadowed his chin. He appeared less like an archaeological discovery than a sleeping man placed carefully into dark water centuries ago. Many bog bodies show signs of violent death. Strangulation, throat cutting, blunt trauma, and ritual deposition recur repeatedly. Scholars debate whether these individuals were criminals, sacrificial victims, political executions, or offerings connected to fertility and landscape rituals. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence. Yet the bogs preserve not only bodies but emotional atmosphere. These people did not vanish anonymously. Their deaths carried social meaning intense enough to shape how communities disposed of them. The same is true in deserts. At Chinchorro mummies, coastal communities in South America began artificially preserving bodies thousands of years before Egyptian mummification emerged. The Chinchorro were fisher-hunter populations living in one of the driest regions on Earth. Some mummies date back over 7,000 years. What astonishes researchers is not merely the preservation, but the care invested in maintaining the dead. Bodies were disassembled, reinforced, reconstructed, painted, and wrapped through complex mortuary procedures. Even infants received elaborate treatment. This challenges older assumptions that sophisticated funerary preservation developed only alongside hierarchical civilizations. Long before kings built pyramids, small-scale societies were already transforming the dead deliberately into enduring physical presences. Why? Scholars still debate the answer intensely. Some believe environmental conditions shaped emotional relationships with death, because natural preservation exposed communities repeatedly to partially intact bodies. Others argue the preserved dead functioned as ancestors remaining socially active within community life. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests prehistoric and early ancient societies often resisted allowing the dead to disappear entirely. Preservation fought oblivion, and nature itself sometimes became an accidental partner in that struggle. At high-altitude Andean sites, frozen child sacrifices preserved by ice still retain braided hair, woven clothing, and traces of ritual preparation. In desert caves, skin and hair survive beside ochre-stained textiles. In Arctic permafrost, entire burial chambers remained sealed beneath frozen earth. Every preserved body becomes both archaeological treasure and emotional confrontation. Because these people still look human, a broken femur inside a cave can feel distant and abstract. A preserved face does not. Modern observers instinctively search for personality in preserved expressions, even when thousands of years separate them from the dead. Archaeologists often describe moments of profound discomfort when excavating well-preserved bodies, because the illusion of recent death becomes difficult to escape. The preserved dead also reveal practical details about funerary customs invisible in ordinary skeletons. Clothing styles, wrappings, hair arrangements, tattoo patterns, plant materials used during burial, evidence of bindings, coverings, or carried objects. Some bodies retain traces of pigments or ornaments now lost entirely from other graves. Others preserve stomach contents showing what individuals ate shortly before death, offering glimpses into final journeys and rituals. And occasionally, preservation captures tragedy itself. A child frozen during migration, a hunter lost in a mountain storm, a sacrificed victim lowered into dark peat water, a body abandoned hurriedly during catastrophe. These moments survive because unusual environmental conditions interrupted the normal disappearance of human remains. Yet even preserved bodies remain incomplete witnesses. Archaeologists can reconstruct injuries, diets, illnesses, and burial treatment. But inner beliefs vanish almost entirely. We still do not know precisely what mourners felt while wrapping bodies or lowering them into graves. We cannot fully recover the prayers, songs, fears, or explanations surrounding death. What survives instead are traces: a preserved hand, a braid of hair, a face emerging slowly from melting ice after thousands of years in darkness. Picture ancient hunters standing beside a frozen body high in the mountains while snow blows across sharp stone ridges. The dead cannot be buried because the ground is harder than rock itself, so the body is wrapped carefully beneath hides and stones, left within the silence of ice where cold air never fully releases it. Millennia later, the mountain gives the body back, and suddenly the prehistoric world no longer feels entirely lost. By the end of the Ice Age, human burial rituals had become far more than responses to grief. They shaped cooperation, memory, territory, hierarchy, and identity across entire communities. The treatment of the dead was no longer a series of isolated emotional acts performed beside individual graves. It had become part of the invisible architecture holding human societies together. In many ways, the path toward larger civilizations may have begun not with farming or cities, but with the decision to remember the dead collectively. Because every burial carried information. A grave taught children who mattered. It reinforced alliances between families. It attached stories to landscapes. It established continuity between generations. It reminded the living that individuals disappeared, but communities endured over thousands of years. These repeated rituals changed how humans understood belonging itself. The dead became social foundations. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that as prehistoric groups grew more complex near the close of the Pleistocene, funerary practices expanded alongside them. Burials became more elaborate in some regions. Cemeteries appeared. Certain individuals received extraordinary treatment compared to others. Grave goods multiplied. Ritual spaces grew larger and more permanent. These developments unfolded unevenly across the world, but together they reveal a major transformation underway. Human societies were beginning to organize themselves through memory. At sites like Natufian culture archaeological sites, dating roughly 15,000 to 11,500 years ago, archaeologists see hunter-gatherer populations becoming increasingly sedentary before the full rise of agriculture. Stone houses appear. Burials cluster beneath settlements. Dogs are buried beside humans. Ornamentation increases. The Natufians still hunted gazelle and gathered wild plants, but their relationship to place had changed profoundly. They stayed longer, and staying longer altered how the dead functioned socially. A mobile hunting band may revisit graves seasonally, but semi-sedentary communities live daily among their ancestors. Burial grounds become enduring centers of memory and identity. Disputes over territory gain deeper emotional force when generations of dead lie beneath nearby earth. Ancestors legitimize claims to land, water sources, hunting grounds, and resources. Some archaeologists believe this growing ancestral attachment helped encourage the transition toward permanent settlement itself. Communities tied emotionally to burial locations became less willing to abandon them completely, even during environmental stress. The dead anchored people geographically. At the same time, funerary ritual likely strengthened cooperation in increasingly large social networks. Organizing burials, feasts, memorial gatherings, and ritual construction required coordination among many individuals. Shared ceremonies reinforced obligations extending beyond immediate kin. Mourning became public rather than purely private. Communities capable of sustaining such cooperation gained social stability in uncertain environments. And uncertainty defined the end of the Ice Age. Around 12,900 years ago, abrupt climatic cooling known as the Younger Dryas disrupted ecosystems across much of the northern hemisphere. Temperatures dropped sharply in some regions after earlier warming had already begun. Plant and animal populations shifted unpredictably. Human communities faced renewed environmental stress precisely as social complexity increased. Some groups adapted successfully, others disappeared. Burial practices from this era sometimes reveal growing social inequality as communities responded differently to changing conditions. Certain graves contain astonishing wealth compared to others nearby. Exotic materials travelled long distances through expanding exchange networks. Ritual spaces became gathering points for dispersed populations navigating unstable landscapes together. Death rituals therefore served practical functions during periods of ecological crisis. They reinforced alliances, redistributed resources, preserved oral memory, stabilized emotional life, created continuity against environmental chaos. At monumental sites like Göbekli Tepe, these trends become dramatically visible. Massive carved pillars arranged in circular enclosures suggest coordinated labor on a scale once believed impossible before agriculture. Human remains at the site appear fragmentary and symbolically treated, including modified skulls. Scholars still debate the exact purpose of Göbekli Tepe, but many interpret it as a ceremonial gathering place where ritual and social identity converged powerfully. Remarkably, large-scale ritual cooperation may have preceded full farming rather than resulting from it. In other words, the need to gather around shared beliefs, including beliefs about death and ancestry, may have helped create the social structures that eventually supported civilization itself. The dead changed the living. This transformation also altered how individuals understood personal identity. Earlier hunter societies likely emphasized immediate relationships within small mobile bands. As ritual systems expanded, people increasingly belonged not only to living groups but to ancestral lineages extending across generations. The self became part of a larger historical continuity, and history itself emerged through ritual remembrance. Without writing, memory survives only through repetition. Funerary ceremonies provided ideal settings for transmitting oral traditions. Stories told beside graves preserved migrations, disasters, alliances, hunting knowledge, and social rules. Burial grounds became archives maintained through ritual action rather than text. Some anthropologists argue that human symbolic thought reached a new level once communities began imagining themselves as enduring entities stretching backward and forward through time. Ancestors represented the past, descendants represented the future. The living occupied the fragile middle space connecting both. Death rituals made that continuity visible, yet the process carried darker consequences as well. As ancestor traditions strengthened territorial attachment and social hierarchy, conflict intensified in many regions. Cemeteries defined group boundaries, elaborate burials reinforced inequality, ritual authority concentrated power among certain individuals or lineages. The same emotional systems that encourage cooperation within groups could also sharpen hostility toward outsiders. Human societies became larger, more organized, and more dangerous simultaneously. Still, beneath all these changes remained a deeply recognizable emotional core. People continued grieving. Parents still buried children carefully. Hunters still carried companions across difficult landscapes. Fire still burned beside graves while stories passed through cold night air. Even as ritual systems grew increasingly complex, funerary behavior retained its intimate connection to loss itself. Picture a settlement near the edge of the warming post-Ice Age world. Forests now spread across valleys once dominated by mammoth steppe. Families gather beside old burial grounds used for generations. Stone houses stand nearby. Dogs move between hearth fires while children play above ancestors buried beneath packed earth floors. Elders recite stories connecting the community to hunters long dead before handing ceremonial objects to younger generations. The dead remain everywhere. In the houses, in the land, in the rituals, in the memory shaping every decision about where to stay, whom to trust, and what future the community hopes to survive into. Civilization has not fully arrived yet, but its foundations are already forming quietly beside the graves. Even now, the ancient dead remain beneath our feet. Beneath parking lots, apartment blocks, highways, farms, forests, and empty coastlines lie the traces of prehistoric grief scattered across the world. A child covered in ochre beneath a construction site. A hunter buried beside his dog under a modern field. Fragments of skulls resting silently below subway tunnels and city streets. Most people pass above these forgotten graves without ever realizing how deeply the living world is layered over the dead. Yet the instincts shaping those ancient burials never truly disappeared. Modern funerals still gather communities around loss, just as prehistoric fires once drew hunters together beside shallow graves. People still preserve photographs, names, ashes, heirlooms, and stories because memory remains emotionally unbearable to lose completely. Cemeteries continue anchoring families to landscapes. Ancestors still shape identity. The dead remain socially present even in highly technological societies that often pretend otherwise. The distance between prehistoric hunters and modern humanity is therefore smaller than it first appears. Across tens of thousands of years, burial rituals changed enormously in detail while preserving remarkably familiar emotional patterns beneath the surface. Ancient hunters painted bodies with ochre. Later civilizations wrapped mummies in linen, built tombs from stone, cremated ashes beside rivers, or sealed coffins beneath churches. Modern societies create memorial gardens, digital archives, photographs, and funeral processions. The forms evolve continuously, but the underlying impulse remains strikingly constant. Humans resist allowing the dead to vanish entirely. Archaeology reveals this continuity with increasing clarity. The deeper researchers explore prehistoric burial sites, the more emotionally sophisticated ancient community appear. Earlier generations of scholars often underestimated prehistoric people because no written record survived, but graves preserve a different kind of evidence of care, symbolism, attachment, fear, hierarchy, and memory. A body carried across frozen ground represents emotional commitment. A child buried with ornaments represents grief. A preserved skull beneath a house floor represents ancestral presence. A communal feast beside a grave represents social resilience. Again and again, the archaeological record shows prehistoric humans transforming death into meaning rather than surrendering entirely to biological disappearance. At the same time, the evidence also reveals humanity's darker capacities: cannibalism, violent deaths, ritual killings, social exclusion, and conflict appear beside tenderness and mourning throughout prehistory. The dead could become sacred, feared, consumed, displayed, protected, or forgotten depending on circumstance and culture. Human responses to mortality were never simple, and perhaps they never could be. Death destabilizes every social system because it exposes the fragility beneath ordinary life. Ancient hunters understood this with brutal intimacy. A single winter could erase half a community. Illness could move silently through camps. Predators waited beyond firelight. Children died unexpectedly. Experienced hunters vanished during storms or migration accidents. In such worlds, funerary ritual became more than symbolism. It became psychological survival. The dead taught the living how to endure uncertainty. Modern archaeology continues uncovering traces of those lessons in astonishing places. New technologies reveal burial sites hidden beneath forests and deserts. Ancient DNA reconstructs family relationships inside graves. Chemical analysis identifies foods eaten before death and migration patterns across continents. Tiny traces of pollen, pigment, ash, and wear marks on bones allow researchers to rebuild fragments of vanished ceremonies. And still, mystery remains everywhere. Scholars debate whether Neanderthals truly practiced symbolic burial or simply disposed of bodies carefully. They debate the meaning of ochre, skull cults, cave burials, and cannibalism. They debate whether certain graves reflect status, spirituality, practicality, or emotional attachment. No single explanation fully accounts for the extraordinary diversity of human funerary behavior across prehistory. That uncertainty matters because it reminds us how incomplete our understanding remains. The people beneath ancient graves did not think in modern categories. Religion, survival, ecology, memory, and social identity likely blended together inseparably in prehistoric life. A burial could simultaneously express love, fear, territorial belonging, spiritual belief, and practical necessity all at once. Archaeology uncovers traces of those emotions, but never the full interior experience itself. Some things disappear permanently. The sound of mourning voices inside Ice Age caves, the names spoken beside ancient fires, the songs sung while carrying bodies across snowfields beneath stars brighter than any modern sky. Those details vanished with the people who once lived them. Yet enough survives to reveal something profound. Long before civilization, before writing, before kings or temples or organized religion, human beings were already refusing to treat death as meaningless. They buried companions carefully. They painted the dead red. They carried bodies across dangerous landscapes rather than abandoning them. They gathered beside graves to eat, mourn, and remember. They preserved skulls, revisited burial grounds, and tied ancestors to the land itself. The foundations of human culture were forming quietly around the dead, and in many ways they still are. Tonight, somewhere in the modern world, mourners gather beside fresh graves while candles flicker in darkness. Families tell stories about people who no longer breathe. Children ask questions adults struggle to answer. Flowers rest above soil, covering bodies that will eventually become bone. The rituals differ from those of prehistoric hunters, but the emotional landscape remains familiar. Love resisting disappearance. Memory resisting silence. The living trying, as humans always have, to continue forward while carrying the dead with them. Because deep beneath every civilization, every city, every language, and every century of human history lies the same ancient truth first learned beside Ice Age fires long ago. The dead never fully leave the living behind. The wind has moved across these landscapes for tens of thousands of years now. Across caves blackened by ancient smoke, across frozen valleys where hunters once carried bodies through snow, across burial grounds hidden beneath forests that did not yet exist when the dead were lowered into the earth. Entire worlds vanished above those graves. Ice sheets retreated. Mammoths disappeared. Rivers changed course. Languages rose and dissolved into silence. Yet beneath the shifting surface of history, traces of prehistoric mourning endured quietly in darkness. A little red ochre still clings to ancient bone. A skull still rests beneath collapsed stone. A child still lies curled beneath soil beside beads carved by hands long turned to dust. Archaeology often feels like the study of disappearance, but sometimes it reveals the opposite. Sometimes it shows how stubbornly human memory resists erasure, even after unimaginable spans of time. The people who buried their dead in caves, beneath hearths, beside rivers, or under open Ice Age skies could never have imagined modern cities, satellites, electric light, or machines capable of reading ancient DNA from fragments of bone. Yet their grief remains recognizable. That may be the strangest part of all. Not the rituals themselves, though many feel mysterious and distant. Not the skulls, ochre, caves, or preserved bodies emerging from ice and peat, but the emotional continuity stretching across thousands of generations. The instinct to stop beside the dead, to carry them home if possible, to gather together after loss, to preserve memory through story, ritual, and place. Those instincts survived every transformation humanity has undergone, and perhaps they always will. Somewhere tonight, wind still moves across forgotten prehistoric graves no living person remembers by name. Grass bends over buried hunters. Rain falls softly onto ancient cave entrances. Rivers continue carving through valleys where mourners once stood beside fires fading slowly into darkness. The people are gone, but the evidence that they loved, feared, mourned, and remembered remains scattered quietly beneath the modern world, waiting in silence for someone to uncover it again.